One of the most publicized things about Elden Ring was the partnership between Hidetaka Miyazaki, lead director of all-time classic games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, and George R.R. Martin, author of the best-selling fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire, which went on to become the uber-popular TV show Game of Thrones. For people like me, who've been fans of both creators for some time, this seemed like a match made in dark fantasy heaven, or hell, I guess I should say. During the lead-up to release, Miyazaki and Martin were both clear about the author's involvement in the game's inception. He created, as Miyazaki put it, the game's Dungeon Master's Handbook, which seemingly refers to the game's lore, world, and key characters, while the story director and his team at From Software did the rest of the work, including the game's story, gameplay mechanics, and the like. Still, in the months since the game's release, Martin's involvement has been, for some, nebulous at best. Many critics, especially those who played Miyazaki's other works, have questioned Martin's impact entirely, arguing that Elden Ring's lore has more in common with the Soulsborne series than anything from the award-winning author's catalog. And honestly, it's a fair point. Elden Ring features a dying, broken world at the end of an era, a host of cosmic entities hoping to exert their will over key characters, and esoteric lore that can be hard to parse without the help of gurus like VaatiVidya. All of this it shares with its predecessors. But it's important to note that this is what they wanted. When Miyazaki met with Martin, he shared with him the themes and concepts that From Software likes to explore in their games. So when Martin set about his work, he surely had their preferences in mind. So when looking for Martin's impact on Elden Ring, it's best to avoid staring down the dying world, the cackling NPCs, and the level-up waifus, and instead look at what they wanted to get out of their partnership with the man behind the Iron Throne. In an interview with Edge magazine back in December 2021, Miyazaki said that they wanted Martin to create the dramatic heroes of the ancient mythos that takes place before the events of the game, the kinds of figures that weren't present in their previous works. Ignoring some serious shade to Gwyn, Ludwig, and the Nameless King, this provides us a pretty clear avenue through which we can explore Martin's influence. Because what Miyazaki is telling us here is that what they wanted from the creator of figures like Arya Stark, Daenerys Targaryen, and Jaime Lannister wasn't just world building, but dynamic and colorful characters. So to find George R.R. Martin in Elden Ring, what we need to do is examine the characters that set the game's tone, that make the story and mythos of the Lands Between come to life. And there's no better place to begin than with the game's first demigod boss, Godric the Golden. From the moment the player departs the tutorial area, the game begins characterizing Godric. The first NPC we meet in Limgrave, Vare, says,
"To Castle Stormvale, over on the cliff, the home of the decrepit demigod, Godric the Grafted."
Calling him Godric the Grafted, not Godric the Golden, his preferred title, is particularly noteworthy here. As noted by VaatiVidya in one of his early Elden Ring videos, Martin has a storied history of giving his characters mocking titles. Those familiar with the shows will know that Tyrion Lannister is the Imp, and that Rhaenys is the particularly savage queen who never was, but this tradition is prevalent in his lore as well. In Episode 8 of House of the Dragon, we very briefly meet Aegon III. He's just a kid now, but he grows up to be a sad boy who looks like he belongs at a My Chemical Romance concert. And to history, he'll end up being known as Aegon the Dragonbane, a moniker he earns thanks to the extinction of dragons under his reign. There's also Aegon the Unworthy, who sired numerous bastard children and gave rise to the Blackfyre Pretenders, a group of would-be usurpers who we'll be talking about in greater detail a few minutes from now. In my opinion, we can learn a lot more about a character from these mocking titles than we would from a more positive nickname. How much does a title like Aegon the Conqueror really tell us? It might tell us what he's done, but it doesn't tell us who he is. These mocking titles show the insecurities of these characters, the flaws that define them the most. So when Vare refers to Godric as the Grafted, it accomplishes the same thing. It tells us that his power was not earned, but taken. And not in the manner of a victorious usurper like Aegon I or Godfrey, but more of a your little brother showed up to the first D&D session and just happened to trip into a pot full of gold sort of way. His power is grafted to him, just as haphazardly and as unnaturally as the countless arms he's added to his body. But mocking titles don't stick if they don't expose a true insecurity. Like any other insult, it doesn't hurt if there isn't a wound there to expose. And for Godric, we learn more about his insecurities from another NPC in Limgrave, the great Kenneth Haight. Haight tells us,
"You might have heard of me, Kenneth Haight. Next in line as the rightful ruler of Limgrave. Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Redan in that castle. Then he insulted Melania, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots rather than die like a man. Has he no shame, the big girl's blouse? And to think, he's the blood of Godfrey, last of the golden lineage, though you almost wouldn't know it to look at him. Yeah, I almost feel sorry for the chap the more I think of it."
there's a lot to unpack here. By describing himself as the rightful ruler of Limgrave, Haight is casting doubt on Godric's authority, and questioning his connection to Godfrey, to the golden lineage, to the very thing he wishes to be known for, paints Godric as a fraud, a phony, or as some might say, a pretender. Of course, Martin's works are full of pretenders to the Iron Throne. In the lore, there's a group of claimants to the crown called the Blackfyre Pretenders. As I mentioned earlier, Aegon the Unworthy had a ton of bastard children, all of whom he legitimized before his death. Among them was Daemon Blackfyre, not to be confused with Matt Smith's problematic heartthrob. He took the name Blackfyre in reference to the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Targaryen, which Aegon had bequeathed to him. It's the sword that Aegon II is wielding here. As you can see, in the heyday of the Targaryen dynasty, Blackfyre was among the most important symbols of their power and legacy. Otherwise, jolly old Viserys wouldn't be clinging to it as he holds court. Alicent even mentions it in episode 9 as something that will help legitimize Aegon II's rule. In any case, to some, the fact that Daemon held Blackfyre made him, and not his brother Daeron, who had been the named heir, the rightful king, leading to a civil war known as the Blackfyre Rebellion. Daemon was eventually defeated, but his descendants would press their claim 4 more times. Examining Daemon's claim to the throne tells us a great deal about how pretenders behave. By clinging to Blackfyre, one of the endearing symbols of House Targaryen, Daemon hoped to style himself as the true king of Westeros. In Elden Ring, Godric does some pretty similar things. Godric wields a massive battle axe, just like Godfrey, the first Elden Lord and patriarch of his lineage. And as we learned in the lead-up before release, Godric was born a weakling child who coveted the strength of his kin. This statement begs the question, whose strength specifically did he covet? It has to be Godfrey. When we meet Godfrey at the end of the game, we discover that he's a man of incredible size, who apparently wrestles for WWE in his spare time. But Godric, when stripped of his grafted limbs, is a short king, and not the good kind. By grafting himself into a hulking brute of a man, Godric is trying to emulate Godfrey. But it goes even further than that. The art of grafting was once practiced by Godfrey himself. That's how his beast regent, Siraj, ended up attached to him. So by practicing the art of grafting, Godric isn't just trying to copy Godfrey in terms of appearance, but action as well. It's also worth mentioning that a close read of item descriptions indicates that Stormvale Castle itself, where Godric makes his home, was the site of Godfrey's last victory before he was exiled from the lands between. So by making his home base here, Godric is again using Godfrey's legacy to prop himself up. All of this is to say that Godric, Daemon, and the rest of the Blackfyre Pretenders are similar in that they use the symbols of past kings to legitimize their own standing, which is a clear sign of Martin's influence on Elden Ring. There's also another striking similarity between Godric and one other potential pretender to the Iron Throne. In the books, there's a character named Young Griff, who claims to be Aegon Targaryen VI. As fans of both the books and the show would know, this Aegon was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, who supposedly died at the hands of the Mountain during the sacking of King's Landing. But in the books, it's alleged that the infant the Mountain killed was just some random kid, and that Varys spirited the real Aegon away to Essos so he could one day return to reclaim his birthright. Assisting Aegon in this effort is the Golden Company, a group of mercenaries who started out as knights who've been banished from Westeros. If you watch the show, then you'd remember them as these dudes, who got redshirted when Daenerys went crazy and burned King's Landing to the ground. But for much of their history, in the books, the Golden Company supported the Blackfyre Pretenders. And now, they're supporting someone who claims to be a Targaryen. Now, as for Aegon VI's supposed heritage, we'll probably never find out the truth, because despite his claims to the contrary, George R.R. Martin has no pages and is not going to finish Winds of Winter anytime soon. But examining the evidence we do have, it's hard to say whether or not he's actually a Targaryen. Still, we do get some hints about this all the way back in A Clash of Kings, when Daenerys visits the House of the Undying. There, she has a vision of a mummer's dragon in front of a cheering crowd. Many fans speculate that this is a clue that Aegon VI is indeed a pretender. So what we have here is a pretender king propped up by an army of mercenaries who started out as banished knights. And back over in Elden Ring, Godric's dominion over Limgrave is supported by similar dynamics. Throughout Limgrave proper, Godric's reign is enforced by his soldiers. They're the ones wearing his tabards pictured here. But once the player reaches Stormvale, the path to the demigod is protected by banished knights. As the name implies, they're knights who were sent to the fringes and forced to start anew. Popular speculation on the internet is that their presence here, back in the Lands Between, the place where they were previously exiled from, suggests that they're serving Godric in a mercenary capacity. So Godric doesn't just have a great deal in common with the Blackfyre Pretenders of the lore, but also a Song of Ice and Fire's most well-established fraudulent heir. But the similarities don't end there, because Godric has something notable in common with the late-era Targaryens, something that has Martin's fingerprints all over it. After defeating Godric, finger reader Enya tells us,
"But remember one thing. The demigods are each and all the direct offspring of Queen Marika. Godric the Grafted was but a distant relation, the runt of the litter. His divine blood sorely diluted."
This is quite the statement from Enya, one that tells us a lot about Godric. Before release, most of us speculated that Godric was the son of Godfrey and Marika, but here, Enya reveals that he's actually a distant relative. He's probably their grandson or great-grandson. As a result, he isn't nearly as strong as the other demigods, because over the generations, the divine blood of the golden lineage became watered down, to the point where Godric had to turn to the powers of the past, like grafting, to make up for his shortcomings. This too happens in the lore of A Song of Ice and Fire with the Targaryen kings. The first of them, Aegon the Conqueror, is presented as a strong and effective ruler, as is his grandson, Jaehaerys. But aside from the two of them, the rest are a bit of a mixed bag, with more failed rulers like Aegon the Unworthy, or outright tyrants like Maegor the Cruel and the Mad King. And even those who did some good things, like Aegon the Unlikely or Viserys I, still sow the seeds of some serious trouble before their time on the Iron Throne is done. So just like with the Golden Lineage, as time goes on, the Targaryen bloodline starts to falter, to the point where it gets usurped by a lowly tarnished, playing as a lord, stag, playing as a king. Ironically, the decline of the Targaryen dynasty is mirrored in the extinction of their dragons. When Aegon the Conqueror came to Westeros, he brought with him 3 dragons, including Balerion, the Black Dread, a dragon of incredible size and strength. In the years that followed, many dragons hatched, but none ever matched Balerion. Over time, the Targaryen dragons got progressively smaller, to the point where the final member of the line, a beast appropriately named the Last Dragon, was described as a sickly, misshapen thing about the size of a mastiff. So this idea that the bloodlines of legends become watered down over time is truly a central theme to Martin's work. And when faced with this reality, that they simply aren't as blessed or gifted as the legends they aspire to be, Godric and the late-era Targaryens turned to similar methods to make up for their shortcomings: the powers of the past. We've already discussed how the art of grafting is linked to Godric's heritage, but even dragons themselves, whom he has an affinity for, were once a tremendous force in the lands between. As Godric himself states,
"Mighty dragon, thou the true-born heir. Lend me thy strength, O kindred. Deliver me unto greater heights."
the player isn't given much context for this line until far later, when they discover secret boss Dragon Lord Placidusax. According to his remembrance, Placidusax was Elden Lord in the time before the Erd Tree, so when Godric grafts the dragon's head onto his arm, he isn't just engaging in a ritual important to the golden lineage, he's also using it to try and steal power from the previous line of Elden Lords. Godric is after any scrap of ancient power he can find. No matter where it comes from, if it can help Godric make up for his faults, he's desperate to use it. And as for those late-era Targaryens, they go about trying to bring back the trademark power of their ancestors, their dragons, in a similarly desperate fashion. Following the death of the last dragon I mentioned earlier, the Targaryen dragons go the way of the dinosaur, but numerous Targaryen kings make attempts to bring them back. Aegon III brings in mages to try and hatch the remaining eggs. Baelor prayed to his egg. Aegon IV had alchemists build mechanical dragons, and most notably, Aegon V's attempt to hatch dragon eggs resulted in the tragedy at Summerhall, where the king himself and many of his closest family members died in a blazing inferno. Of these attempts, Aegon III and Aegon V stand out the most to me, as both turned to ancient and dangerous magic to try and make up for their lack of power, just like Godric the Grafted. And while Aegon III's attempt only ends in failure, Aegon V's fiery massacre ends up setting the stage for an usurper, something our many-armed pretender can relate to. So, in summary, Godric the Grafted is connected to the works of George R.R. Martin in three key ways. He's got a mocking title, like Tyrion Lannister, Rhaenys, and pretty much every Aegon other than numero uno. Like the Blackfyre Pretenders, he clings to the iconography of past lords and uses mercenaries to prop up his illegitimate claim. And like the late-era Targaryens, whose legendary blood was by then sorely diluted, he uses the powers of the past to try and make up for his own shortcomings. Am I arguing here that Godric is somehow a chimera of Game of Thrones lore? Not at all. But the presence of so many of Martin's trademark storytelling techniques suggests that he was far more involved in the formation of Elden Ring's incredible characters than many have come to believe. And the more I examine those characters, the more I'm baffled that anyone would dismiss his influence on the game, because everyone from General Radahn, to Melania, to Morgoth, to Rykard, and even Marika herself are just full of so many of the things that made his Game of Thrones characters so memorable for readers and viewers. They've got a lot in common with those characters as well. So if you enjoyed this video, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and share if you're so inclined. I'd love to do some more videos about this topic, because I think there's a lot that the Elden Ring and Game of Thrones communities can learn from each other. I'd love to see some more Game of Thrones fans give Elden Ring a try, or see some Elden Ring fans pick up a copy of Game of Thrones or watch the show. I really think there's a lot more room for some cross-pollination and collaboration between these two fan bases. Until then, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.